Bonjour, Sego, hello, and welcome everyone. Thanks for being here with us this afternoon for this talk, which is co-sponsored by the Department of History and Classical Studies, the Indigenous Studies Program, the Indigenous Studies and Communication Engagement Initiative, and the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC. My name is Daniel Bella, and I'm the director of MISC. Today, I would like to start by acknowledging that while we meet on a virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. Please note that today's lecture is being recorded. Please make sure that your microphones are muted in order to avoid any interruptions. If you have any questions, you can use the chat box and you can write your questions at any time during the talk, and they will be answered later on, of course, after the speaker is done. So there will be a Q&A at the end, which will be moderated. And you can submit your questions as you go or wait immediately after the end of the talk. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, or MISC, is the Center for Canadian Quebec Indigenous Studies at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians, and we are proud to be co-hosting this talk today. To find more about our upcoming events, you can visit our website at mcgill.ca/misc, M-I-S-C. I will now turn to Noelani Arista, Associate Professor of History and Classical Studies and the Director of the Indigenous Studies program here at McGill, who will introduce our speaker today. Noe, it's all yours.
Aloha mai kākou, o Noelani Arista ko ui noa no Honolulu mai iau. Aloha, my name is Noelani Arista, and I am the chair of McGill's Indigenous Studies program and interim director of the Indigenous Studies and Community Engagement Initiatives, co-sponsors of today's event. Today, we welcome Professor Daniel Rück, assistant professor in the Department of History and the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies at the University of Ottawa, whose talk entitled The Legal and Environmental Chaos of the Settler Colonial Invasion in 19th Century Canada, Quebec, Montreal, and Ghanawage is based on his new book, The Laws and the Land, The Settler Colonial Invasion of Ghanawage in 19th Century Canada. Dan's research concerns land tenure and land use on Indigenous territories, with a focus on Indigenous legal orders and how empires and nation states opposed and undermined them. Dan is a settler scholar living and working on the unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation along the Kitchissippi River. More particularly, he studies the history of land, law, and colonialism in Ghanawage, a Ghanawage community near Montreal, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I practiced it. I have to keep working on it. We are also honored to have Ghanadaze Horn as respondent. Ghanadaze is a member of Ghanawage, but also has his family in Ghanadaze. He is a PhD student in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University. His research focuses on urban Indigenous experiences and the way in which urban Indigenous peoples have developed strong and unique communities in Canadian cities. The order of things today will be that Dan will first give his talk, followed by a response by Ghanadaze, which Dan will respond to, followed by a general audience Q&A. Thank you very much for attending, and mahalo, Dan, take it away.
everybody. Segon, it's so great to, and bonjour too. So great to be here with you virtually. And maybe I jumped the gun here in terms of sharing my screen, but I guess, yeah, I'll go to, yeah, I want to speak to you a little bit more directly here to start. I want to thank everyone who was involved in organizing this event, and thank you so much for Elspeth Heeman, my doctoral supervisor from a while back, who organized this event, or who sort of didn't do it all herself, but initiated it, and all the different institutions and people that were involved. I'm not even aware of everyone who had a hand in it, but the Department of History and Classical Studies, the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, the Indigenous Studies Program, Indigenous Studies and Community Engagement Initiative. Thank you so much for everyone pitching in. I spent, by way of introduction, I spent some of the best years of my life living in Montreal and attending McGill University and later teaching there. In 2002, when I arrived in Montreal by Greyhound bus from Edmonton to start a qualifying year for an MA at McGill, I didn't have any way of knowing what would lay in store for me for the next 20 years. And I'm so grateful for both the ups and the downs of the 20 years since then. In some ways, the feelings I experienced with this particular book launch remind me of the ones that I felt 10 years ago in 2012, when I presented my work for the first time publicly in Kahnawà at the public library and in the newspaper and on the radio, just a few months before defending my dissertation at McGill. And one of the other things that reminds me of that moment is how nervous I am today. So that's good to be taken back to those wonderful moments 10 years ago. I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces here. What an incredible diversity of both known and unknown names and faces that I'm seeing here, people from all the different communities that I've been part of the last 20 years. And that's really great. And then 10 years ago, just as now, I was striving to be in good relationship and accountable to those who are most impacted by my research. And I see this presentation as part of that too, as part of my accountability. And you're also important to me, and you've taught me so much. So by way of introduction, I'll do share my screen here. And we'll skip over this nice poster that the organizers made. Thank you very much for that. There we go. By way of a land acknowledgement, I want to first introduce myself and my own family history that's deeply entwined with British and American settler colonial invasions into Ireland, Kentucky, and Illinois on my father's side, and with 18th century settler colonial invasions of German farmers into areas of Hungary newly acquired by the Habsburg Empire at the expense of mostly Slavic farmers and ranchers. And when they were eventually dispossessed in the 1940s, they became refugee settlers who eventually found their way in the 1950s to Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory in what had by then become known as the province of Alberta. I did much of the research on Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee Algonquin territory when I lived in Montreal and completed my PhD at McGill, but I also did some work on it while living in the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples when I was in Toronto as a postdoc. I worked and reworked much of this book living on unceded Algonquin territory while living in Gatineau and working as a professor at the University of Ottawa. And I just want to thank many of my teachers who have guided me on this work, Ghanawage elder and scholar Brian Deere. A big influence, Elspeth Heeman, who is one of the people who organized this today, Ghanawage friends, leaders and historians, Deon Wizende, Garhowane, and many others. I'll start here by, wait, did you didn't have this up on screen when I was just talking, did you? Now you see the satellite image, right? Okay. The Lines in the Land is a history of Canada-Indigenous relations that focuses specifically on the relationship between Canada and Kahnawà. I argue that settler historians of previous generations have massively overemphasized the orderliness and lawfulness of Canadian colonialism. So much ink in Canadian historiography has been spilled to assert that Canada's territorial expansion was orderly and non-violent compared to that of the United States. Indigenous people have long disagreed vehemently with this framing, and new historical research is confirming that the difference has been greatly exaggerated, and that from the point of view of the colonized, Canada's land theft and violence of resource extraction, destruction of Indigenous families, violence against children, just to name a few examples, are anything as violent as what Indigenous people experience south of the border. My book shines the spotlight. I mean, it's just one of many kind of emerging texts that are showing this kind of, making these kind of arguments recently, specifically on, and my book does it specifically on the legal and environmental chaos in Ghanawage that was caused by colonial interventions. Just one of many, many stories of this kind across Turtle Island or North America. Okay, I'm going here to this image here, early colonial relationships. The book begins by describing early colonial relations between Ghanawage. I'm going to just go quickly through the book so you have, those of you who haven't read it yet get an idea of what it's about. In the French Empire and later in the context of the British Empire, some have described early colonial relationships during this period as a kind of legal pluralism, a situation where multiple legal orders and systems operate in the same geographical area. Jan Grabowski, Denis Delage, Etienne Gilbert have written about the way in which Indigenous law was generally applied to Indigenous people, colonial law was generally applied to settlers, and this was the status quo until the end of the 19th century. I still struggle with this, until the end of the 1700s, the end of the 18th century, which is the first time an Indigenous man from Ghanawage sued another Ghanawage man in a colonial court. And that's one of the chronological starting points for the story that I tell in the book in terms of invasion. And I just want to talk a little bit about this term invasion, because I think it's those of you who, some of you may find that unusual to speak about invasions in this way, because I'm mostly not speaking about invasions of soldiers and guns, although I do include an image here from 1990 in the Ghanawage resistance and the Oka crisis, where the full force of the Canadian military and police forces was actually unleashed on Ghanawage and Ghanawage over a land issue, like they usually are. The invasion in this book is not mostly a military invasion, although I'm reminded by people in Ghanawage that, and others Indigenous people, that the threat of military violence always lurks, or police violence always lurks. And I think this is particularly striking in the context of our current blockades in the city of Ottawa and other places where non-Indigenous people are holding certain kinds of protests that are being treated very, very differently than Indigenous people are treated when they block a road or if they were to block a border. And this has been pointed out by many, many, many people, and it comes as no surprise, the difference in the way that different types of protests are treated in Canada, Canadian history, and in the Canadian present. But what to talk about in the book is an invasion of colonial values and laws. They're headed up by bureaucrats, Indian agents, politicians, and land surveyors and business people, businessmen. It's important for me to use the language of invasion and words like chaos to communicate the violence, the aggression, a level of racist destruction that more and more are being recognized as genocidal. The book is a story of colonial interference in Indigenous lives, rooted in the idea that settlers and settler governments have all the answers and license to do what they want to Indigenous people. Colonizers believed it was their right and duty to impose their law on Indigenous people and lands, even while Indigenous people continued to assert their laws and values in the face of a colonial order that was at best indifferent and at worst murderous. So what's described in the book is a colonial relationship, an unbalanced relationship, rupture, abuse, control. And on the other side, the story of a nation that continues, of people who continue and give the lie to the 19th century truism that they would disappear. So I'll just go through a couple of the types of invasions that the book covers, but I won't spend a lot of time on each one. The book is organized chronologically, and each chapter shows new ways in which Canada's invasion into Ghanawage unfolded over time. Chapter 2 reveals the first time a Ghanawage-Rono or a Ghanawage Mohawk took another Ghanawage-Rono to a colonial court over an internal dispute, and it discusses the efforts of Ghanawage chiefs to write and enact a legal code that would bring their laws to bear in a written form. Then I talk at various points about various cultural invasions, religious ideas, capitalist ideas, language colonialism. And so chapters 2 and 3 begin a discussion on the way capitalist ideas about land and nature begin to find their way into Kahnawà. Missionaries of all stripes, mostly early on Catholic, but later on Protestants, work often with Indian agents to try to change Ghanawage ideas about race, gender, nature, health, and everything else really. So those are just some examples there. I talk about environmental invasions, and there I think chapter 4 and 5 are strongest, especially discussing the imposition of colonial legal concepts around land through the Indian Act. In the context of Ghanawage law, which had been focused on ensuring fair distribution of land, food, and energy. For example, individuals weren't allowed to hold more land than they could work themselves. Land was not to be used, or land that was not used for more than 3 years could be taken up by somebody else. Those kind of things that were, those kind of legal principles that were designed to ensure distribution of resources. I talk in different parts of the book more towards the second half about capital industrial invasions, such as railways and bridges. And here you have an image of current day Kahnawà that really shows sort of the downtown or the main village area of Kahnawà, with the Mercier Bridge in the foreground and the seaway also, which cut straight through the village in the 1950s. And dispossessed a lot of people and cut the village off from the river. I talk about, sorry, someone needs to say something? Oh, okay. Hi. Cute. Love hearing the babies. Right on. So cartographical invasion then is more, I get more into that in chapter 6, but it's about the way Ghanawage was conceptualized by outsiders as non-agricultural, underutilized empty space by colonial cartographers. And this is a ubiquitous settler colonial tactic that is global in scale, was used everywhere, still is used to show Indigenous land as available for settlement and as a prelude to settler land theft. Chapter 6 focuses on cadastral invasions as well, which cadasters has to have to do with property and property maps. And this chapter focuses on the colonial invasion, where these were attempts to completely redistribute land and impose Canadian private property and agricultural norms on the small territory this nation had left. It was a project that spent all the community's money in a bid to enfranchise everyone and fragment or eliminate the nation's land base. And so that's something I've also written about in the Canadian Historical Review. So those are just some of the invasions that I discussed in the book. But I want to talk specifically about the case that I write about in chapter 7. And I think I want to focus specifically on chapter 7 because it was probably the most difficult chapter to write. And those of you who read it may also agree that it's difficult to read. But I do hope you'll try. I think it's really important in that it shows one incident, especially that where Kahnawà or Ghanawage Mohawks experienced the chaos of colonialism in a very particular way in the 1890s. So it's chronologically the last chapter before the conclusion. And the chapter demonstrates some of the ways in which Ghanawage also lived their lives according to their own laws long after the Indian Act had been imposed. And I just want to note that many are doing that or attempting to do that to this day. So So chapter 7 focuses on a small piece of land referred to by officials of the Department of Indian Affairs as Lot 205. And it's that little shape outlined by gray in the middle. This isn't the best map, but you see that there's rail lines that are depicted on this map, and they come together, and off the top of the map, that's the approach to the bridge, the CPR bridge. And that gray shape there in the center is the lot that we're talking about. Only 9.4 acres. Well, which I guess if you're thinking in terms of a farm, that's small. But if you're thinking in terms of an urban lot, that's very big. For those of you who have maybe a hard time conceptualizing what 9.4 acres is. 10 years after this lot had been surveyed by the Wallbank survey, the Wallbank survey was that survey that I talked about, where an outside surveyor was sent in by the Department of Indian Affairs to try to understand, map, and create property boundaries between people. So 10 years before that lot had been surveyed the first time, but it seemed nobody in Ghanawage saw it as a piece of land or as a bounded lot. Right? There's different ways of seeing land, and nobody referred to it. No one in Ghanawage referred to it as Lot 205. When officials said, tell me about Lot 205, nobody knew what they were talking about. The people who talked about this saw it as a small hill with trees and fields that people worked on and in. And in the fall of 1893, the CPR expropriated that hill. That's the Canadian Pacific Railroad, expropriated the hill and began to excavate it as a borrow pit. The earth that was taken from Lot 205 was used to build the approach to the CPR bridge, an approach that can be seen in the photo of the cover of the book. So you can see here on the left, there's an image from 1944, an aerial image showing on the bottom left, you can see some of the houses of the village, and then you have the elevated approach going to the bridge that you can't see, and then towards the center of the image, you can see the Mercier Bridge, which is an automobile bridge that was built in the 1930s, which today is twinned, but at the time it was just one. So here we're talking about the approach in the foreground, and if you look carefully, you can see a tunnel that was built for car traffic through that approach. And actually, this is an aside, but it gives you an indication of how little thought was put into this. But when this approach was built, no one cared, no one from the CPR cared whether or not that approach, which is like a wall, interrupted or just, interfered with people's ability to get around. So people in the community had to fight for a long time to get that tunnel through the approach built after the fact, which is still there today. And then on the right side here, you have the image from the front of the book, which is somebody, I don't know who it is, but it's someone wearing a hat, a man presumably, who is standing on that approach going towards the bridge. And perhaps it's a surveyor, perhaps it's an Indian agent, perhaps it's a photographer's friend, we don't know. So that lot 205 was excavated in order to build that approach, and the earth was taken. Right, so I'm going to the next image now. The colonial archives don't reveal anything about the taking of the lot, so there's no, sadly, like for a lot of historical research, there's no blow-by-blow narrative, and I haven't met anyone in Kahnawà that remembers that particular event either. But there appear to have been no notice given, so they just went in, excavated without any thought as to who might be impacted, or even who owns that piece, or who might have claims to it. When the company finally got around to thinking about compensation a year afterward, they sent the Department of Indian Affairs $558, and now it was up to the department to determine who would receive the money. Although the DIA surveyor William Walbank had in the 1880s spent thousands of dollars from the Ghanawage Band Fund to map and value lots and determine their supposed owners, the information was apparently useless in determining who would receive that compensation. 3 men claimants came forward. One of them had a strong claim, including a lot of community support, so he was given some of the compensation money right away. But the Department of Indian Affairs and its Indian agent launched an inquiry to attempt to determine who would receive the rest of the money. And it's clear from all the evidence presented that there had been no conflict about the lot before the expropriation, and that multiple parties had used the hill for various reasons without any problems that anyone could remember. The English language, perhaps more than any other, is defined by capitalist relations, so it's hard to talk about the way in which this area of land was owned, managed, used, shared, etc., without evoking capitalist land relations. But here's an example of Ghanawage Land Law continuing to be practiced in the 1890s. Law that prohibited land hoarding, encouraged sharing and wealth distribution, and discouraged exploitative labor and land relations. The inquiry allowed each claimant to bring in witnesses, each of whom were questioned, and the testimony by each is rich in detail. All vividly remembered the land before it was a CPR borrow pit, who they saw work there, what they did there, what they planted, whom they cut wood with, who spent more time on the high part of the land and who spent more time on the low part of the land. The inquiry reveals the detailed and personal memories of this place that no longer existed, intricate ecological, legal, and interpersonal relationships. Multiple people had interconnected relationships with that land, and without incident until the land was taken and destroyed. That's one example of the chaos of colonialism, not only environmental destruction, but simultaneous rupture of good relations and ethical reciprocity. And nearly 20 years after the imposition of the Indian Act, 7 years after the imposition of the band council system on Ghanawage, many Ghanawage continued to live and think outside the confines of colonial law, just as many do today. Several witnesses made direct references to Ghanawage legal principles like the one which ensures that a person could not own a piece of land without working it. And if a person didn't work the land anymore, someone else would be free to use it. And here I've got on this slide, I've got some quotes from the inquiry. The first one here, he did not tell me that he had a document, but he told me that it was he who had worked on the land, right? So here, this is the witness who is saying, I didn't hear anything about anybody having a document or a deed, but the man did tell me that he worked it. And the second case here, it has been the custom here that whoever worked a piece of land became owner of it and was recognized as such by the tribe. So this is an instance where we can see real continuity in legal conceptions from the earlier chronological part of the book around 1800 until the end of the 1800s. The Lot 205 case also shows the claimant with the least community support was the one who also attempted to base his argument on the supposed existence of a deed to the land which he said he had lost. The arguments between claimants and the Indian agent after the inquiry revealed that there was a lot of resentment towards those in Kahnawà who had provided themselves with notarized deeds for land and had thus deprived others of wood and agricultural land. And then this last quote is the Indian Advancement Act has created nothing but divisions, enmity, and separation among us. It has degraded us rather than promoted. Those people being really clear at the end of the 19th century, Ghanawà leaders and regular people with really important insights. And here's an image of that lot, not today because it's not winter time, but it's a few years ago. It's part of the Ghanawà golf course. The hole is now filled in and it's now a maintenance area for the golf course. So that whole, I think it's such an interesting example of a lot of people's memories happening in a place that no longer existed. So to conclude, the book as a whole points to a collective refusal of Ghanawà to use the language of Audra Simpson, a refusal collectively and individually, a refusal of the colonial order that Canada continues to hoist on them. The book is also my expression of hope that we can speak frankly about what happened and what's happening, not as some dark chapter or thing that happened to Indigenous people accidentally, but as something deeply evil that happened and continues to happen, and my expression of hope that we can do better. When I began this research, I thought I was researching something external, something that happened long ago to other people that helps to explain our current world. But increasingly, I saw connections between everything. I saw current events that looked a lot like the history I was reading. I saw current prime ministers acting a lot like 19th century ones. I saw Indigenous resistance and refusal that looked a lot like that of their ancestors. I didn't need historian Patrick Wolfe to tell me that settler colonialism is ongoing, but I did recognize immediately what he was talking about when I read him. The other connections that have become increasingly evident to me are the connections between my everyday relationships and my research. Indigenous scholars from John Burroughs to Leanne Simpson and Sean Wilson, and including Haudenosaunee scholars, including Gahande Horn Miller, Amber Meadow Adams, Vanessa Watts, just to name a few. They all focus on the importance of good relationships. And I'm slowly learning to value the connections between things, not just the things themselves. I'm a slow learner, but I have some talented teachers, including some of you in this room. Some other important teachers were my divorce a few years ago, my child and parenting itself, a serious back injury that allowed me to see myself in new ways. Spiritual teachers like the late Thich Nhat Hanh, my own hard feelings have taught me a lot. And I've learned so much about colonialism by noticing and confronting my own controlling and punishing assumptions. and instincts towards myself and towards others. Just as racism and misogyny aren't just out there, but they're deeply embedded in myself, so also are colonial attitudes and assumptions embedded in the deepest parts of my being. Some have treated this diagnosis that I just gave as hopelessness, but I find it wonderful because it shines a spot on my own agency to be able to do something about it. I may not be able to transform the external world all that much, but I can work to transform myself. And it's my hope that true change can flow from there. My book, aside from showing many details of this exploitative and destructive relationship in history, is also an argument for a future in which settlers and settler governments, and also settler scholars, change our ways in order to build relationships of trust and respect, and to work together to support Indigenous resurgence and sovereignty. Thank you so much. And I'll just put on my thank you screen here, now on Kahnawà. Ghanawage, are you ready to go?
Here.
Great.
Am I supposed to just go right off the bat?
Go for it. You've already been introduced.
All right. Well, yeah, we'll go for that. Yeah. So listening to your talk there, you know, people might think that we chatted a lot before this because we're going to be mentioning a lot of the same people, but we did not actually chat in preparation for this. Well, we did. We text message and stuff, but I guess we're just on the same wavelength here in terms of our thinking. And so with that being said, you know, also I'd like to say that, you know, I'm doing this in Gatineau, kind of just down the road from Dan actually. So I'm on the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Anishinaabe people myself. And I understand my relation to that community and do my best to be a really good a guest on their lands and to advocate for their sovereignty in any way that I can. So the first time I met Dan actually was about 9 years ago. I met him in Montreal. I had randomly reached out to him to kind of figure out my future. I don't know if Dan remembers this, but we met at a random restaurant in Montreal on Wellington Street. And kind of, I asked him, I had never met Dan, but he was very pleasant. He was very nice to talk to. And he gave me a lot of good advice that led to me eventually pursuing my own PhD studies myself. So to begin, I'd like to say Sago, Ghanawage Horn Yunjuts. I am the son of Frank Tayautagane Horn and Elizabeth Gatitsiosta Horn from Ganasadage, whose maiden name is Gabriel before she met and married my father. I am the youngest of 5 children, and I am proud to say I'm a member of Ghanawage. And for any Ghanawage folks in the room, I'd like to say Gwe, Sago, and that I hope my interpretation and reading of Dan's book resonates with you. I was asked by Dan to present a response or a commentary to his book, The Law and the Lands, the Settler Colonial Invasion of Ghanawage in 19th century Canada, which he graciously gifted to me over the holidays. After I received the book, I immediately started to read it, where I was pleasantly surprised to see how he was going to be discussing this very critical period in our history as Ghanawage Ronu. That is, not only was he going to be adding a significant depth to our understanding of settler colonialism and the dispossession of our lands, but I was also excited to see that he was going to frame this period in time as a clash between competing legal orders, or as a conflict between competing understandings of law and law's relationship to land. This was important to me, not only as an emerging Ganyagahaga scholar that researches about Indigenous law myself, but also as a Ghanawage Ronu who has come to understand more about the law of the Mohawk people and the Haudenosaunee more generally. I feel that Dan's appreciation for Mohawk law in his book needs to be highlighted and highly emphasized. In my experience, it is quite rare to come across any history texts that explore the experience of Indigenous peoples that include any mention that Indigenous people had law. Instead, there is a tendency to overlook this fact about Indigenous peoples, reinforcing a settler colonial trope that Indigenous peoples were lawless and had unsophisticated relationships with land and territory. Dan breaks free from this in his book and sets out on a new path. He goes beyond merely mentioning that the Mohawks of Ghanawà had law, and instead centers this fact about our people in ways that allow the reader to see that the Mohawks of Ghanawà were motivated and inspired by their nation's laws that stem from the Kahnawà, or the Great Law of Peace. This can be seen in Dan's observations about the way the community dealt with conflict, which we saw when the leaders in the early 19th century dealt with Aguarante by banishing him from the community, to even in the late 19th century, when some members of the community relied upon Mohawk conceptions of property and ownership to deal with conflict over a piece of land, which Dan talked about with the history of Lot 205. Dan does an excellent job of looking through the archival record to not only locate these stories, but to also then go even further and reinterpret them to find Mohawk law. In my mind, this is an amazing and innovative methodological choice on Dan's part that can have a tremendous influence on the discipline, not only in history, but disciplines overall, and in the academy more broadly. With that in mind, this is not only a story about Mohawk law, but it's also a story about dispossession, conflict, and the community's desire to remain intact and not disappear as a people, despite being neighbors with Montreal, which is Canada's second largest city. Dan's decision to frame settler colonialism this way and focus on conflict or Indigenous resistance is noteworthy, as it unsettles any notion that settler colonialism is guaranteed to accomplish its goals, or that Indigenous people just sat back and allowed it to happen. I can remember the first time reading Patrick Wolfe, so here I am, mentioned Patrick Wolfe, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, and thinking that yes, absolutely, settler colonialism did indeed seek to eliminate Indigenous peoples in Canada, and that yes, settler colonialism absolutely happens every day, which is in reference to Wolfe's famous description that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. As I journeyed in my academic career, though, I came to realize that Wolfe and others had conveniently left out Indigenous voices and their experiences and their assessment of settler colonialism, leaving the reader to possibly assume that settler colonialism was uncontested or that it had achieved its goals of eliminating Indigenous peoples. While Dan references Patrick Wolfe's description of settler colonialism, he shifts away from this idea in a major way and challenges the idea that the elimination of Indigenous peoples is a certainty, and instead centers Mohawk voices and their histories of resistance. That is, Dan recognizes that Mohawks of Ghanawà did not sit back and allow settler colonialism to progress, but instead the community and its leadership continue to articulate their sovereignty and nationhood, even when it seems like an impossibility. For example, faced with the reality that the Band Council was going to be imposed regardless of their resistance to its introduction, I really enjoyed reading about how the Mohawks at that time in the late 19th century selected leaders that would be antagonistic to this settler government. Just got my Mohawk juices flowing. To me, this demonstrated that even when faced with a near impossible situation, the Mohawks found a way to undermine and resist their colonization. Resisting settler colonialism within imposed colonial spaces is significant and should not be read or interpreted as a desire to assimilate or even to try to change the system from inside, but rather, as fellow Ghanawà scholar Audra Simpson has said, It is indicative of a politics of refusal, a refusal to go away and be who the government wanted us to be. So in my mind, it is an inversion of those spaces. Dan interprets these political moments, including in the late 19th century, as an indication of the ongoing relevance of Mohawk law, or an indication of an ongoing legal consciousness. I fundamentally agree with his assessment of these moments, but I feel that it is fair to say that I wish he could have unpacked this a little bit more in his book. While I understand that he was relying upon archival records and is not a Mohawk speaker, and I should mention myself that I'm not a Mohawk speaker either, I think it would be interesting to see how he would have unpacked these moments of resistance, these articulations of Mohawk law, with an understanding of what the Mohawk word for law actually translates to. As I've come to know things and my growing yet limited understanding of the Mohawk language, the Mohawk word for law is Ghanawà. And if I might have mispronounced that, my apologies, which translates to conducting yourself in a peaceful manner, with the root word being yoyanare, which means good. Considering the Mohawks, like other Indigenous peoples, were largely non-hierarchical and privileged individual autonomy, the word law, or Ghanawà, takes on a new meaning that allows us to see that Mohawk society functioned when individuals knew and enacted their roles and responsibilities within a series of kinship networks. With this definition in mind, I can say that when I read these passages within Dan's book, particularly in those final chapters, I can see that, particularly in those final chapters, I saw the community deciding to mobilize these imposed colonial spaces in ways that allowed them to continue to fulfill their legal obligations. While I know that this is a rather contentious claim to make, knowing the community's history between the Band Council and the Longhouse, I think it is a fair assessment of our history and how our ancestors confronted a rather difficult situation. My comments above are not a critique of Dan or his book, but rather an invitation to continue pursuing this kind of research, albeit with these kinds of insights in mind. I think that Dan has demonstrated he is a careful and empathetic scholar and a human being that understands the significance of law in our lives as Mohawk people. I see Dan as an ally and someone that arguably knows his own roles and responsibilities in relation to the Mohawk people, as someone who can point out injustice and articulate his anti-colonial position in ways that do not reproduce the common tone we see within some historians who may use neutral voices or language when describing the devastating effects of colonialism and settler colonialism. Where was I here? Yes, so Dan's book, The Laws in the Land, is a must read. It is a must read to understand how our people, the Mohawk people, have resisted their colonization. It is a must read for those who wish to unsettle their understanding of Indigenous experiences with settler colonialism and the assumption that settler colonialism unfolded smoothly without protest or resistance from Indigenous people. So to conclude, I wish to ask Dan one question that I think might deepen our understanding of things and allow Dan to speak about things that he wasn't able to talk about in his book. And it might come out of left field for some in the room, but I think it's still an important question that I'd like to put forward to Dan. So you mentioned in your book that your book does not have a satisfying ending since the story of the Mohawks of Ghanawage is ongoing. I wonder if you could speak about your understanding of Ghanawage's history of dwindling resources, which you describe in your book, and the rise of alternative economies that started to emerge afterwards, where Mohawks from Ghanawage left to major cities like Chicago and New York City as ironworkers, as only one example. I ask this because there's a theory within some of the scholarship out there, which you mentioned in your book, that the enclosure of the commons or the dispossession of those commonly held lands led to individuals being forced to enter the market economy to sell their labor. So they couldn't participate on their lands anymore. So they have to go into the city to sell their labor to survive, which is a heavily Marxist take on things. This is a theory that is largely rejected by some, like Dene scholar Glenn Bouchard, since he argued that Canada wasn't interested in Indigenous labor, but instead that they just wanted the land. So I wonder if you could unpack how this experience of Ghanawage Ronu complicate this academic debate. So that's my response to your book, and I just want to say that I love the book. It was a really great book to read, and I hope that you all get a chance to read it if you hadn't already. So Nyawa go.
Thank you, Ghanawage. I really appreciate those comments. Thank you for paying such careful attention to it. It's one of the biggest compliments anybody can, as those of you who have written books or articles know that it's a really wonderful thing when people read your book carefully and have really interesting things to say about it. So thank you for that. And I actually, even the things that barely resemble critiques there, Ghanawage, I really love that because it goes to show that no work is ever done, right? And I really see my work like as something that I hope other people can build on. And if someone can, if it's not me that can do that work, then I hope someone who has better insights on those particular aspects can do that work in the future. And that question is a really great one because it really opens up so much space. I can take it in sort of any number of directions, which is a wonderful question from the point of view of someone being asked it. So I can try to avoid the shoals and go towards other things. Dwindling resources and rising of alternative economies. Those of you who don't know the history of Ghanawage know that you should know that Haudenosaunee communities, villages were moved every 10 to 25 years, at once a generation, generally speaking. In pre-colonial and early colonial times, these villages were ones that were semi-permanent. They were in a spot, and then that spot would become a little less fertile, agriculturally speaking. The firewood would be farther away, and then the people would go to a different spot in the region where they could build new buildings and clear new fields. So that's a tradition that came to an end in Ghanawage, I think 1716, with the establishment of the permanent village and the fact that settlers were taking up that land all around them. And I think I would think about that experience of being sort of hemmed in as a kind of enclosure. So enclosure, for those of you who don't know, just means like enclosing something. Usually it's referring to fences, but it can also refer to hedges in the English tradition. But it's really a lot of Marxists, but other economic theorists see it as sort of a beginning of capitalist land formations, labor formation. And it is really important to point out differences between enclosure in England, enclosure in Europe, and how it happened here. And Alan Greer's book, of course, points I forget the exact title, but it points us towards some of those differences. And one of the big differences between England and North America in the 19th century was that they had an inverse relationship between the value of land and labor. So in England, land was very expensive and labor was very cheap, right? So people weren't paid very much, but land was very expensive. And in North America, it was the opposite, where labor was very expensive. Yes, labor was much more expensive and land was cheap, right? Initially, because of all the land that was being stolen from Indigenous people and the homesteading acts and such. And so that really changed the way these things unfolded. And there's, I think there's a lot of really interesting work that's been done on that. But this book is really specifically focused on Ghanawage land, which there's lots of other scholars who have focused on Ghanawage labor, especially on the labor of men. right? And there's some really interesting work on that. Historians Nicole St. Onge, one of my colleagues here at the University of Ottawa, has written articles on Mohawk involvement in the fur trade, in establishment of Indigenous communities on the prairies. David Bouchard, an anthropologist who worked in Kahnawà, wrote quite a bit on the continuity of Ghanawage men's relationship with war. Men were associated with war or with fur, with hunting and going out, going away from the village, going into the forest and going out and doing things. Women were gendered more local, around village agriculture, governance of the village space. And so anthropologists like David Bouchard have pointed to sort of a continuity between that older way of doing things and the newer male involvement in the fur trade. Still men going far away, in this time in the context of wage labor, later in iron work, and also things like circus performing and crafts, that sort of thing. So I think that my focus in the book, I really tried to stay away from, of course I mentioned those things, but I tried to stay away from talking too much about labor in the book and talked a lot, really focused on land and focusing specifically, my recent active history piece talks about Ghanawage activism trying to stop continuing land theft on their borders today and trying to contextualize that, right that specific territory there and showing the continuity for hundreds of years now of settlers moving in every imaginable way and taking pieces of it. So I don't want to keep talking too much about that, but I see there's some activity in the chat and I see no hands. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left, and I do have two questions from audience member Russell Limry. The first is, I'm just going to give you both of them. What about a documented option to run the St. Lawrence Seaway via Ghanawage instead of expanding Lachine Canal? A shorter route choice was made on cheaper, lower costs, displacing Ghanawage Ronu. And the second question focuses on, have allies of opportunity, Jesuits, French, British, have they transformed and evolved? And what might be the new allies now? Academia, the UN, social media. And I kind of want to fold my question into that second question, which is, hey, tell us a little bit more about how you as a settler scholar works directly with the community and expands the reach of archives to people in community.
Thank you for all those questions. I'll start with the one about the St. Lawrence Seaway, because that's one for volume 2 of the book, I guess. If I were to write one about the 20th century, the St. Lawrence Seaway would figure really prominently. And many people in Kahnawà see the St. Lawrence Seaway as the biggest environmental catastrophe that ever happened to them. And I think I want to affirm what Russell is saying there in terms of that's possible. I haven't looked into it. I haven't researched that, but there are lots of examples here of what people now refer to as environmental racism, right? Putting that kind of heavy industrial infrastructure through Indigenous lands because it's potentially cheaper. Because that community is less able to defend itself. And there are so many examples of that in history that I certainly wouldn't rule that out for the St. Lawrence Seaway. We do know that even the Wellbank survey, which I do talk about in the book, is very specific. Wellbank asks the Department of Indian Affairs how he's supposed to value the land. Should I value the land as land that in the same way that I would of white people? Or do I value it as land that's only able to be sold among people in Ghanawage? And he was told only as land that's on reserve. You can value it that way. So of course the valuations were much, much lower. And even today, anyone that's familiar with reserve land economies, the value of land for those very reasons are much, much lower. And people's ability to borrow money against their land are really limited as well. So yes, when it comes to building a railroad through, putting hydro lines through, putting a seaway through, all those things, you know, the fact that land is valued so much lower and expropriation costs a lot less makes a big difference. Okay, great, thank you for those comments. So my relationship, I can't talk too much about it. We don't have a ton of time, but I began my research with an interest in land surveying. It was really abstract, kind of what we were talking about before. I didn't begin my relationship with Ghanawà in a good way, I would say. I began it by thinking about a thing. I was thinking about a thing in history, about land surveying and how it's related to Indigenous dispossession. And so then I encountered a whole bunch of interesting things in the archives, including the Wallbank survey, and then was able to thankfully begin my relationship with people in Ghanawà after the fact. After finding those documents and drawing my own conclusions based on not very much, based on very much sort of outsider knowledge. Colonial frameworks, and then being able to speak to people in the community about it. I didn't do oral history, I didn't do formal interviews, but I did spend a lot of time in the community, and I continue to try to interact, run my writing, run my ideas past people to make sure I don't go off the rails. But it is the kind of thing that I find really important, those relationships of accountability. Even I see this as a moment of accountability of if there's any of you that want to talk to me about something I've said or want to address something that I've written in my book that you as someone from Kahnawà have an issue with, I'm always all ears.
Well, if there's no more questions, I do want to read a comment from someone in the community of listeners. Tonya Williams said that she found this to be a wonderful presentation on the history of our community and issues that we continue to struggle with. So I'd also like to raise these voices up before everyone here listening and commend you for the work that you did in your presentation. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ganataze. And hey, Kate, you want to say some final words?
You're on mute, Kate.
Yeah, I was just looking for my mouse, Dan. I've got it. Great. So it's now my job to bring what I think was a very important and illuminating conversation to a close. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Catherine Desbarras, and I'm the chair of the Department of History and Classical Studies here at McGill. So along with my history colleagues who are here with me, Noé, who's opened the conversation and led the Q&A, and Elspeth Heeman and Elizabeth Elborn, who helped make the event happen, I want to begin by thanking Dan for his work and for sticking it out and finishing that PhD, bringing the book to fruition, and under what sounds like not the easiest of circumstances and conditions. So thank you, Dan, for doing that. And it's work, it's hard work, and we're all benefiting from it. And I'd also like to thank Ganatace Horn for engaging with the work closely and carefully, and encourage you in your doctoral studies. And we look forward to following your work, because I'm hearing a very thoughtful voice, and I look forward to seeing where you go. And so collectively and together, you've very much whetted our appetites to read the book. And I think Blair Elliott from MISC, who we should also thank for putting this together, has put a link to the book in the chat if you can see it. I'll just add, it's a tribute to Dan's work that he's brought so many different people together. And I'm so glad that there are people from Ghanawage here, maybe Kanesatake as well. Different parts of McGill, the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, Indigenous Studies, history. This is how work needs to be done, and it needs to be heard across different audiences in this way. And I'll just say land, colonialism, law, violence, these are issues that we have to come to terms with again and again across the space that we call Canada. We need many more studies that contain both the kind of fine-grained detail that Dan gives us, that are alert also to the larger processes at work. And I think we need, as Noé kind of did in the questions, and as Dan has tried to do in the presentation and the book, and indeed Kanatase in his comments, we need to amplify the voices of those who lived through these disruptions. They're not always heard, and we need to hear them, and we need to, as I say, amplify them. Those who lived through the kinds of things that he talks about. And I'll just end with the following plea. May many more allies, many more Dans, and many more Kanatases pass through. I'll make a pitch for a history department. Kanatase's gone elsewhere, but a pitch for historians to unravel these stories in all of their unsettling complexity. Give us more books to launch and more conversation, and perhaps someday, even in Ganyangeha. Sorry, I've mucked it up. Ganyangeha. So on that note, I'll say Nyawin. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone.